8-year-old Leah Robinson stood up in that packed courtroom and said something that made everyone burst into laughter. "Release my father and I will make you walk." The judge, confined to his wheelchair for years, couldn't help but smirk. But 30 seconds later, that same judge was standing on his own 2 feet, and nobody was laughing anymore. This is the true story of how a little girl's faith moved mountains and changed everything in ways no one could have ever imagined. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in courtroom 7, casting harsh shadows across Daniel Robinson's face as he sat in the defendant's chair. His hands, calloused from years of honest construction work, trembled slightly as the orange prison uniform clung uncomfortably to his shoulders. The air was thick with tension and the musty smell of old leather-bound law books. Daniel's dark eyes swept across the room, taking in the sea of unfamiliar faces who would decide his fate. These weren't his peers, they were strangers who had already made up their minds based on lies and fabricated evidence. The prosecution had painted him as a dangerous criminal, someone who had allegedly embezzled money from the construction company where he worked. But Daniel knew the truth. He was being framed by his former business partner, Marcus Blackstone, a billionaire developer who owned half the city. Blackstone needed a scapegoat for his own financial crimes, and Daniel, a hard-working black man with no political connections, made the perfect target. The evidence against him was meticulously crafted, each document and witness testimony carefully orchestrated to ensure his conviction. Judge Henry Whitmore sat behind his bench, his weathered hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair with visible frustration. At 70 years old, the judge had seen countless cases, but this one felt different somehow. His gray hair was combed back neatly, and his piercing blue eyes studied the case files with the intensity of someone who had dedicated his life to the law. The judge had been confined to his wheelchair for 3 years now, ever since a stroke had robbed him of his ability to walk. Despite his physical limitations, his mind remained sharp as ever. Daniel's wife had died 2 years earlier in a car accident, leaving him to raise their daughter alone. Every day, he worked double shifts to provide for 8-year-old Leah, making sure she had everything she needed for school and her future. He coached her little league team on weekends and helped her with homework every night after coming home covered in construction dust. Now, sitting in this courtroom, he realized that all his dreams of giving his daughter a better life were crumbling around him. The prosecution was seeking a 15-year sentence, which meant Leah would be 23 by the time he got out. The courtroom was packed with reporters and curious onlookers, all drawn by the high-profile nature of the case. Marcus Blackstone himself sat in the back row, his expensive suit and confident smirk serving as a reminder of the power imbalance in this fight. The billionaire developer had enough money to buy the best lawyers, influence key witnesses, and ensure that the truth remained buried. His construction empire had been built on the backs of honest workers like Daniel, but now he was willing to destroy an innocent man to protect his own interests. Daniel's court-appointed attorney was fresh out of law school, overwhelmed by the complexity of the case and the resources arrayed against them. The young lawyer had done his best, but it was clear that they were outmatched from the start. Every piece of evidence they tried to present was challenged by the prosecution's team of expensive lawyers. Every witness they called was discredited by investigators hired by Blackstone's legal team. The deck was stacked, and everyone in the courtroom could feel the weight of inevitable defeat. As the prosecutor finished his closing argument, painting Daniel as a greedy criminal who had betrayed his employer's trust, Daniel felt his heart sink into his stomach. The man's voice echoed through the courtroom with the confidence of someone who knew he had already won. Charts and graphs displayed on a large screen showed financial discrepancies that supposedly proved Daniel's guilt. Bank records, emails, and witness testimonies all pointed to one conclusion: Daniel Robinson was guilty of embezzlement and would pay the price for his crimes. The judge listened intently to both sides, his expression giving nothing away as he weighed the evidence. His years on the bench had taught him to remain impartial, but something about this case troubled him deeply. The evidence was almost too perfect, too neatly packaged to be entirely believable. Yet the law required him to base his decision on facts, not suspicions or gut feelings. The wheels of justice moved slowly but inexorably toward what seemed like an inevitable conviction. Daniel's shoulders sagged as he realized that his fate was all but sealed. In just a few moments, the judge would render his verdict, and Daniel would be led away in shackles to begin serving his sentence. He thought about Leah, who was staying with her grandmother during the trial. How could he explain to an 8-year-old that her daddy was going away for something he didn't do? How could he tell her that sometimes good people suffer while bad people prosper? The prosecutor's final words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Your Honor, the evidence clearly shows that Daniel Robinson betrayed his employer's trust and stole money that belonged to hardworking investors. Justice demands that he pay the full price for his crimes. The man's satisfied smile suggested he was already planning his victory celebration. In his mind, this was just another successful prosecution that would boost his career and potentially lead to political opportunities. Marcus Blackstone watched from the back of the courtroom with cold calculation in his eyes. Soon, Daniel would be behind bars, and the investigation into the construction company's finances would be closed permanently. The billionaire had covered his tracks perfectly, using his vast wealth and influence to manipulate witnesses and fabricate evidence. Another obstacle to his empire had been eliminated, and he could continue his business practices without interference from honest workers who might ask uncomfortable questions. But as Judge Whitmore prepared to deliver his verdict, none of them could have predicted what was about to happen. None of them knew that a small, determined voice was about to change everything in ways that would challenge their understanding of justice, faith, and the power of innocence. The fluorescent lights continued to buzz overhead, but something else was stirring in that courtroom, something that would soon turn their carefully orchestrated plan upside down. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open just as Judge Whitmore reached for his gavel. All eyes turned toward the sound, and there, standing in the doorway like a small beacon of hope, was 8-year-old Leah Robinson. Her grandmother had driven her straight from school, her blue dress slightly wrinkled from the hurried journey. The little girl's dark eyes scanned the intimidating courtroom until they found her father sitting at the defendant's table. Her heart broke at the sight of him in that orange prison uniform, looking defeated and alone. Leah's small hands clutched a crumpled piece of paper, a drawing she had made for her daddy during art class. It showed two stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun, with the words "Me and Daddy Forever" written in colorful crayon. She had planned to give it to him after the trial, when they could go home together and have their usual dinner of mac and cheese while she told him about her day at school. But looking at the somber faces around her, she began to realize that things might not go according to plan. Daniel's breath caught in his throat when he saw his daughter. He had specifically asked his mother-in-law not to bring Leah to the courthouse, wanting to spare her from witnessing his humiliation. But here she was, his little angel, looking so small and fragile in this room full of adults who held his fate in their hands. Her presence filled him with both overwhelming love and crushing despair. How could he protect her from the harsh reality of what was about to happen? How could he explain that sometimes the system failed good people? The bailiff, a stern-faced man who had seen it all during his 20 years of service, noticed the child and started walking toward her. His job was to maintain order in the courtroom, and unauthorized visitors were not allowed during proceedings. But something about the little girl's determined expression made him pause. She wasn't crying or causing a disturbance, she was simply standing there with a quiet dignity that seemed beyond her years. Her dark eyes held a mixture of fear and fierce determination that touched something deep in his withered heart. Judge Whitmore looked up from his notes and saw the child standing at the back of his courtroom. In 3 decades on the bench, he had rarely allowed such interruptions, but something about this moment felt different. The little girl's presence seemed to shift the very atmosphere in the room, bringing a sense of innocence and truth to a place that had become consumed with legal technicalities and political maneuvering. He found himself curious about what this child might have to say about her father's case. Leah took a deep breath and raised her small hand, just like she did at school when she wanted to ask her teacher a question. The simple gesture was so innocent and pure that it caused several people in the courtroom to lean forward in their seats. The reporters sensed that something unexpected was about to happen, and they readied their notebooks and cameras. Marcus Blackstone shifted uncomfortably in his seat, irritated by this disruption to what should have been a straightforward conviction. "Excuse me, Your Honor," Leah said in her clear, sweet voice that somehow carried across the entire courtroom despite her small stature. Every conversation stopped, every whisper died away, and all attention focused on this brave little girl who had dared to speak in a place where children were rarely seen and never heard. Her courage was remarkable, especially considering the intimidating environment filled with stern-faced adults in expensive suits and formal robes. She stood perfectly straight, showing no signs of the fear that must have been racing through her young heart. The prosecutor, caught off guard by this unexpected development, started to object to the interruption. His carefully planned presentation was being derailed by a child who had no business being in his courtroom. But Judge Whitmore raised his hand, signaling for silence. Something in the little girl's demeanor commanded respect, and he found himself genuinely curious about what she might say. His own children were grown now, but he remembered the honesty and wisdom that sometimes came from young voices. Daniel felt tears welling up in his eyes as he watched his daughter find the courage to speak in this intimidating setting. He wanted to protect her from this moment, to shield her from the harsh realities of adult corruption and injustice. But he also felt an incredible pride in her bravery. Even at 8 years old, Leah had always been wise beyond her years, often surprising adults with her insights and emotional intelligence. She had helped him through the darkest days after her mother's death, offering comfort and strength when he thought he might collapse under the weight of grief. The courtroom fell into an unusual silence as everyone waited to hear what this child had to say. Reporters held their breath, sensing that they might be witnessing something extraordinary. The jury members, who had seemed ready to deliver a guilty verdict just moments before, now found themselves genuinely curious about this unexpected turn of events. Even the court stenographer paused in her typing, caught up in the strange magic of the moment. "Your Honor," Leah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I know you're about to make a very important decision about my daddy." Her small hand smoothed down her blue dress, a nervous gesture that reminded everyone present just how young and vulnerable she was. Yet there was something in her posture and the way she held her head high that suggested an inner strength that belied her age. She had practiced this moment in her mind during the car ride to the courthouse, knowing she might only get one chance to save her father. But what happened next would shock everyone in that courtroom and change the course of justice forever. None of them could have predicted the words that were about to come from this innocent child's mouth, or the miraculous events that would follow. The stage was set for something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about faith, justice, and the power of a child's love for her father. Leah Robinson looked directly at Judge Whitmore, her 8-year-old voice carrying a conviction that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her soul. The words that came next would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. "Your Honor, if you release my daddy, I will make you walk." The silence that followed her statement was so profound that the ticking of the courtroom clock seemed as loud as thunder. Every person in that room held their breath, trying to process what they had just heard from this innocent child. The first reaction came from the gallery, where a businessman in an expensive suit let out a nervous chuckle. His laughter was quickly joined by others who assumed this was simply a child's fantasy, born from desperation and a lack of understanding about the real world. The sound grew and spread throughout the courtroom like wildfire, until nearly everyone was laughing at what they perceived as a naive and impossible promise. The reporters exchanged knowing glances, already imagining the headlines about a delusional child disrupting a serious court proceeding. Marcus Blackstone's laughter was the loudest and most cruel of all. The billionaire developer threw back his head and laughed with genuine amusement, his expensive silk tie gleaming under the fluorescent lights. To him, this was the perfect ending to his carefully orchestrated frame-up of Daniel Robinson. Not only was he about to destroy an innocent man, but now he got to witness the humiliation of watching a child make impossible promises in a desperate attempt to save her father. His cold eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he savored this moment of complete victory. Judge Whitmore himself couldn't suppress a slight smile at what he perceived as childish innocence. In his 3 decades on the bench, he had heard many desperate pleas, but never one quite like this. The old judge's withered hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair tighter as he considered how to gently explain to this child that miracles didn't happen in courtrooms. His stroke 3 years ago had left him with no feeling in his legs, and the best doctors in the country had confirmed that he would never walk again. The nerve damage was too extensive, the paralysis too complete. The prosecutor couldn't contain his amusement at this unexpected comic relief in what had been a serious criminal proceeding. His professional demeanor cracked as he exchanged amused glances with his legal team, who were all trying to suppress their own laughter. This was exactly the kind of desperate, emotional outburst that confirmed they were dealing with a guilty man whose family was grasping at straws. In his mind, the case was even more solidly won now, as the defendant's own daughter had just provided comic relief to what should have been a somber moment of justice. The jury members looked at each other with expressions ranging from amusement to pity. These 12 citizens had spent weeks listening to complex financial evidence, witness testimonies, and legal arguments. Now they were being asked to believe that an 8-year-old girl could somehow heal a paralyzed judge if they found her father innocent. Several jurors shook their heads in disbelief, while others felt genuine sympathy for a child who was clearly in denial about her father's guilt and the judge's permanent disability. But while the courtroom erupted in laughter, Daniel Robinson felt his heart breaking into a million pieces. His beautiful, brave daughter was being mocked by a room full of adults who saw her faith as nothing more than a child's fantasy. The orange prison uniform felt even more suffocating as he watched the people around him laugh at his daughter's innocent belief. He wanted to stand up and defend her, to tell them all to stop laughing at the purest heart in that entire courtroom, but the bailiff's stern presence kept him in his seat. The laughter continued for what felt like an eternity, echoing off the wooden walls and high ceiling of the old courthouse. Court reporters continued taking notes, already imagining how this bizarre incident would be reported in tomorrow's newspapers. The bailiffs tried to maintain order, but even they were struggling to keep straight faces at this unexpected turn of events. The whole scene had taken on an almost surreal quality, as if reality itself had been suspended for this moment of collective disbelief. Stories like this one need to be heard by everyone who believes in the power of faith and innocence. Make sure you subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what happens next, because what occurred in that courtroom will restore your faith in miracles and remind you that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest truth. Yet as the laughter reached its peak, something extraordinary began to happen. Leah Robinson didn't back down, didn't cry, didn't run from the room in embarrassment as many children would have done. Instead, she stood even straighter, her dark eyes filling with a determination that seemed to come from a source beyond her 8 years. The mockery of the adults around her only seemed to strengthen her resolve, as if their disbelief was actually fueling something powerful within her young spirit. The little girl's unwavering confidence began to have a strange effect on the courtroom atmosphere. Gradually, the laughter started to fade as people noticed that she wasn't backing down from her extraordinary claim. There was something in her posture, something in the way she continued to look directly at Judge Whitmore, that suggested she truly believed every word she had spoken. Her faith was so pure, so absolute, that it began to make some of the adults uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite understand. Marcus Blackstone's laughter died in his throat as he realized that this child was not going to be discouraged by their mockery. Something cold and uncomfortable settled in his stomach as he watched Leah Robinson stand her ground against an entire room of laughing adults. For the first time since this whole elaborate frame-up began, the billionaire developer felt a tiny flicker of uncertainty. Not because he believed in miracles, but because there was something unsettling about the girl's absolute conviction that defied all logic and reason. Judge Whitmore studied the small figure standing before his bench with growing fascination. In 30 years of presiding over criminal cases, he had never encountered anything quite like this moment. The child's unwavering gaze seemed to penetrate right through his judicial robes and wheelchair, seeing something that others couldn't see. Her dark eyes held no trace of doubt or fear, only an absolute certainty that made him question everything he thought he knew about reality. The courtroom had grown quieter now, as if everyone was beginning to sense that something profound was happening. Leah took 3 small steps forward, her patent leather shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. Each step seemed to carry the weight of destiny, as if she was walking toward something that had been predetermined long before any of them entered this courtroom. Her blue dress rustled gently as she moved, and the afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows seemed to create an almost ethereal glow around her small frame. She carried herself with the dignity of someone much older, someone who had been entrusted with a mission that transcended the understanding of the adults around her. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier amusement now replaced by a growing sense of unease. Something about the child's presence was disrupting his carefully constructed case in ways he couldn't quite comprehend. His expensive law degree and years of courtroom experience had taught him to trust in evidence, procedure, and logic. But none of his training had prepared him for this moment, when a child's faith seemed to carry more weight than all his legal arguments combined. He found himself unable to look away from her steady gaze. Daniel Robinson watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and heartbreak that threatened to overwhelm him completely. Even in his darkest moments after losing his wife, he had never felt such a profound combination of love and despair. Leah's courage in the face of ridicule reminded him why he had fought so hard to build a good life for her, why every sacrifice had been worth it. But now, watching her stand alone against the mockery of strangers, he felt like he had failed her in the most fundamental way possible. How could he protect her from the cruelty of a world that dismissed faith as foolishness? The bailiff found himself frozen in place, uncertain whether to maintain order or allow this unprecedented situation to continue unfolding. His hand rested on his radio, ready to call for backup if needed, but something held him back. The little girl posed no threat to anyone, yet her presence seemed more powerful than any disturbance he had ever handled. The 20-year veteran of courthouse security had seen defendants break down, lawyers lose their composure, and judges struggle with difficult decisions. But he had never witnessed anything that felt as significant as this quiet moment. Members of the jury began to lean forward in their seats, their earlier amusement giving way to genuine curiosity about what would happen next. The financial evidence that had seemed so damning just minutes earlier now felt somehow less important than this child's unwavering belief in her father's innocence. Several jurors found themselves remembering their own children, wondering what it would feel like to have such absolute faith in something that seemed impossible to everyone else. The case was no longer just about embezzlement and fraud, it had become something much more profound. Judge Whitmore's medical records were clear and undisputable. The stroke had caused extensive damage to his spinal cord, leaving him permanently paralyzed from the waist down. The best neurologists in the country had examined him, conducted countless tests, and delivered the same verdict every time: he would never walk again. Physical therapy had been abandoned after 6 months when it became clear that no amount of exercise could restore function to his damaged nervous system. Yet here was a child who seemed absolutely certain that she could change what medical science had declared unchangeable. The reporters in the gallery exchanged uncertain glances, no longer sure what kind of story they were witnessing. What had started as a straightforward criminal trial was evolving into something that defied categorization. Their training told them to remain objective observers, but the atmosphere in the courtroom was becoming charged with an energy that seemed to affect everyone present. Cameras that had been focused on the defendant now turned toward the small girl who had somehow become the center of attention without saying another word. Leah's grandmother sat in the back row, her weathered hands clasped tightly in her lap as she watched her granddaughter display a courage that took her breath away. The elderly woman had raised 6 children of her own and helped raise Leah after her daughter's tragic death, but she had never seen such unwavering faith in someone so young. Her own heart was breaking for Daniel, knowing he was innocent but powerless to prove it. Yet watching Leah stand with such conviction gave her a hope she hadn't felt since this nightmare began. The courtroom's atmosphere continued to shift as people began to realize that something extraordinary was taking place. The usual sounds of shuffling papers, whispered conversations, and creaking chairs had given way to an almost cathedral-like silence. Even Marcus Blackstone had stopped smirking, though his expression remained coldly skeptical. The billionaire's vast wealth and influence had always been enough to control any situation, but he was beginning to sense that his carefully laid plans might be threatened by something he couldn't buy or manipulate. As the seconds ticked by, Judge Whitmore found himself genuinely considering the impossible. His rational mind insisted that what the child was suggesting was medically impossible, but something deeper was stirring within him. He thought about the dreams he still had sometimes, dreams where he was walking through the park with his grandchildren, dreams that always left him feeling hollow when he woke up in his wheelchair. Could it be possible that faith could accomplish what medicine had declared impossible? But what none of them knew was that Leah Robinson carried within her heart a secret that would soon transform skepticism into wonder, doubt into belief, and despair into miraculous hope. The real test of faith was about to begin, and everyone in that courtroom was about to witness something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the boundaries between the possible and the impossible. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the hushed courtroom like thunder in a canyon. His withered hands trembled slightly as he gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, trying to maintain the dignity and authority that had defined his 3 decades on the bench. The weight of his judicial robes seemed heavier now, as if the gravity of this moment was pressing down on everything in the room. He had presided over murder trials, high-profile corruption cases, and life-changing custody battles, but nothing had prepared him for the challenge of responding to a child's impossible promise with the wisdom and compassion it deserved. "Young lady," Judge Whitmore began, his voice carrying the gentle but firm tone he reserved for the most delicate situations, "I appreciate your love for your father, and I can see how much you believe in what you're saying." His blue eyes, clouded with age but still sharp with intelligence, studied Leah's face for any sign that she might reconsider her extraordinary claim. The fluorescent lights above cast shadows across his lined features, highlighting the exhaustion that came from years of making decisions that affected people's lives. He genuinely didn't want to crush this child's spirit, but he felt obligated to help her understand the reality of the situation. The courtroom remained suspended in absolute silence as everyone waited to hear how the experienced judge would handle this unprecedented situation. Court stenographers had stopped typing, lawyers had stopped shuffling papers, and even the bailiffs stood perfectly still as they witnessed this extraordinary exchange between judicial authority and childlike faith. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension and anticipation, as if the very atoms in the room were holding their breath to see what would happen next. Time seemed to slow down, creating a moment that felt both eternal and fleeting. Leah looked up at Judge Whitmore with eyes that seemed to hold depths of wisdom far beyond her 8 years. Her small hand smoothed down the front of her blue dress, a gesture that reminded everyone of how young she was while simultaneously displaying a composure that many adults would envy. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows created a natural spotlight around her, as if the universe itself was drawing attention to this pivotal moment. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a clarity and conviction that seemed to resonate through every heart in the room. "Your Honor," Leah said, her words measured and deliberate, "I know what the doctors told you about your legs. I know they said you'll never walk again." The simplicity of her statement hit the courtroom like a physical blow, causing several people to gasp audibly at the child's direct acknowledgement of the judge's condition. She wasn't speaking from ignorance or naive optimism, she understood exactly what she was promising to accomplish. Her dark eyes never wavered from Judge Whitmore's face as she continued, "But sometimes what doctors say isn't the last word. Sometimes love and faith can do what medicine can't." Marcus Blackstone felt a chill run down his spine despite his determination to remain unmoved by what he considered emotional manipulation. The billionaire developer had built his fortune on his ability to read people, to identify their weaknesses and exploit them for his own benefit. But this child was unlike anyone he had ever encountered in his ruthless climb to wealth and power. There was something in her manner that suggested she possessed knowledge or abilities that he couldn't understand or control. For a man who was accustomed to buying his way out of any problem, this was deeply disturbing. The prosecutor found himself at a complete loss for how to handle this situation. His legal training had taught him to object to irrelevant testimony, to maintain focus on the evidence, and to prevent emotional appeals from derailing the pursuit of justice. But how could he object to a child's expression of love for her father? How could he argue against hope, even if that hope seemed misguided? His carefully prepared closing arguments suddenly felt inadequate in the face of this display of pure faith. The case that had seemed so straightforward was becoming complicated in ways he had never imagined. Daniel Robinson felt tears streaming down his cheeks as he watched his daughter display a courage that humbled him completely. In the 2 years since his wife's death, he had tried to be both mother and father to Leah, working extra shifts to provide for her while still being present for homework, bedtime stories, and weekend adventures. But in this moment, he realized that she had been teaching him lessons about faith and love that he was only beginning to understand. Her willingness to stand before this intimidating courtroom and make an impossible promise for his sake filled him with a love so profound it threatened to stop his heart. The jury members found themselves caught between their duty to base their verdict on evidence and their growing emotional investment in this unprecedented situation. Several of them were parents or grandparents themselves, and they could imagine how they would feel if their own children were in Leah's position. The financial documents and witness testimonies that had seemed so compelling earlier were now competing with something much more powerful: the unwavering faith of a child who refused to accept that her father could be guilty of the crimes he was accused of committing. Judge Whitmore's own emotions were in turmoil as he struggled to balance his judicial responsibilities with his human compassion. The medical facts about his condition were undeniable. Extensive testing had confirmed that the nerve damage from his stroke was permanent and irreversible. Yet looking into this child's eyes, he found himself remembering dreams he had buried, hopes he had abandoned, and faith he had lost along the way. The rational part of his mind insisted that he needed to gently redirect this situation back to legal matters, but something deeper was stirring within him. As the weight of this impossible moment pressed down on everyone in the courtroom, one thing became clear: they were all witnessing something that transcended the normal boundaries of legal proceedings. Whether through divine intervention, the power of pure faith, or something else entirely, this 8-year-old girl was about to attempt something that would either restore their belief in miracles or break their hearts with its inevitable failure. The stage was set for a confrontation between faith and reality that would change everyone present forever. Leah Robinson closed her eyes for a moment, her small hands clasped together in front of her blue dress as if she was drawing strength from some invisible source. The courtroom watched in absolute fascination as this 8-year-old child seemed to center herself with a composure that many adults would envy in such a high-pressure situation. When she opened her eyes again, there was something different about her expression, a deeper certainty, a quiet power that seemed to radiate from her small frame. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows had shifted, creating an almost ethereal glow around her as she stood before the judge's bench with unwavering determination. "Your Honor," Leah said, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom with crystal clarity, "my daddy didn't steal that money. He's the most honest man in the world, and he's taught me that sometimes you have to have faith even when everyone else thinks you're wrong." Her words seemed to hang in the air like music, each syllable resonating with a truth that touched something deep in the hearts of everyone present. The simple eloquence of her statement contrasted sharply with the complex legal arguments they had been hearing for weeks, cutting through all the confusion to reach the core of what really mattered. Judge Whitmore felt something stirring deep within his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced since before his stroke 3 years ago. His medical condition had been thoroughly documented by the best neurologists in the country, yet as he looked into this child's eyes, he felt the faintest tingling sensation in his legs for the first time in years. The rational part of his mind insisted this was impossible, that nerve damage of his severity couldn't be reversed by faith or willpower. But something beyond reason was beginning to awaken within him, something that medical science couldn't measure or explain. The billionaire Marcus Blackstone leaned forward in his seat, his earlier amusement now completely replaced by a cold dread that settled in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't going according to his carefully orchestrated plan, and for the first time in decades, he felt like he wasn't in complete control of the situation. His vast fortune had always been enough to manipulate witnesses, by favorable testimony, and ensure that justice worked in his favor. But he was beginning to realize that some forces couldn't be purchased or controlled, no matter how much money he threw at the problem. Leah took another step closer to the judge's bench, her patent leather shoes clicking softly against the marble floor with each movement. The sound seemed to echo through the silent courtroom like footsteps approaching destiny itself. Her grandmother, watching from the back row, felt tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she witnessed her granddaughter display a faith that put her own to shame. The elderly woman began to pray silently, asking for protection for this precious child who was risking everything for her father's freedom. The prosecutor sat frozen at his table, his mouth slightly open in disbelief as he watched this unprecedented situation unfold before his eyes. All his legal training, all his experience with courtroom procedure, had become completely irrelevant in the face of this child's extraordinary faith. The evidence against Daniel Robinson was overwhelming, the case was airtight, and the conviction should have been guaranteed. Yet somehow, this little girl was transforming the entire atmosphere of the proceeding with nothing more than her unwavering belief in her father's innocence. Judge Whitmore gripped the armrests of his wheelchair tighter, feeling something extraordinary beginning to happen within his damaged body. The tingling sensation in his legs was growing stronger, accompanied by a warmth that seemed to flow through his entire nervous system like liquid fire. His heart began to race as he realized that something impossible was actually occurring. The medical experts had been absolutely certain that his paralysis was permanent, yet he could feel sensation returning to limbs that had been dead to him for 3 long years. Daniel Robinson watched his daughter with a mixture of overwhelming pride and desperate fear, knowing that she was putting everything on the line for his sake. The orange prison uniform felt like it was suffocating him as he realized the magnitude of what his 8-year-old daughter was attempting to accomplish. If she failed, and logic insisted that she must fail, her heart would be broken in the most devastating way possible. Yet her courage and faith filled him with a hope he hadn't dared to feel since this nightmare began. The court reporter stopped typing completely, her hands hovering over her keyboard as she realized that no words could adequately capture what was happening in that moment. The journalists in the gallery had put down their notepads and cameras, sensing that they were witnessing something sacred that transcended the boundaries of ordinary news reporting. Even the bailiffs stood transfixed, their usual vigilance replaced by awe as they watched this extraordinary confrontation between childlike faith and adult skepticism. The jury members found themselves leaning forward in their seats, completely captivated by this display of pure conviction from someone who wasn't even old enough to understand the complexities of the legal system. Several of them felt tears welling up in their eyes as they watched this brave little girl risk everything for her father. The financial evidence that had seemed so damning earlier was beginning to feel less important than the truth they could see shining in her eyes. Then, as everyone in the courtroom held their breath in anticipation, Judge Whitmore felt something incredible happening to his body. The sensation in his legs was no longer just tingling, it was becoming genuine feeling, real awareness of limbs he had thought were lost forever. His hands trembled as he realized that the impossible was actually beginning to occur. The boundaries between medical fact and miraculous faith were starting to blur in ways that would change everything he thought he knew about reality. What happened next would shock every person in that courtroom and prove that sometimes the faith of a child can move mountains, heal the broken, and restore justice in ways that defy all human understanding. The moment of truth had finally arrived, and everyone present was about to witness something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Judge Henry Whitmore's eyes widened in absolute disbelief as he felt strength flowing back into his legs for the first time in 3 years. The medical impossibility of what was happening couldn't override the undeniable reality of sensation returning to his paralyzed limbs. His withered hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair as he felt muscles that had been dormant since his stroke beginning to respond to his commands. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the elderly judge's expression transformed from skepticism to wonder, his face illuminating with an emotion that seemed to transcend anything they had ever witnessed in their lives. Slowly, deliberately, Judge Whitmore placed his hands on the armrests and began to push himself upward. The effort seemed to take forever, each inch of movement watched by dozens of eyes that couldn't believe what they were seeing. His black judicial robes rustled as he rose from the wheelchair that had defined his limitations for 3 long years. The sound of his movement was the only noise in the absolutely silent courtroom, where even the ventilation system seemed to have stopped humming out of respect for this miraculous moment. When he finally stood fully upright, towering over his bench with the dignity befitting his position, the silence was so complete it felt sacred. The prosecutor's expensive pen slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor, the small sound echoing through the courtroom like a gunshot in a cathedral. His carefully constructed case, built on fabricated evidence and purchased testimony, suddenly felt as insubstantial as smoke in the wind. All his legal training, all his professional experience, had never prepared him for a moment when the impossible became reality right before his eyes. The documents spread across his table seemed meaningless now, mere papers in the face of something that transcended human understanding and legal procedure. Marcus Blackstone's face had gone completely white, his usual arrogant confidence replaced by a terror he had never experienced in his entire privileged life. The billionaire developer realized that his vast fortune, his political connections, and his ability to manipulate the system meant absolutely nothing in the face of whatever power this child possessed. For the first time in his life, he was confronting something he couldn't buy, control, or destroy. His elaborate frame-up of Daniel Robinson was crumbling around him, and there was nothing his money could do to stop it. Daniel Robinson felt his heart exploding with joy as he watched his daughter accomplish the impossible through nothing more than pure faith and love. The orange prison uniform that had symbolized his humiliation now felt like a costume he would soon be able to remove forever. Tears streamed down his face as he realized that his 8-year-old daughter had just saved him in a way that no lawyer, no appeal, and no amount of evidence could have accomplished. Her courage had moved heaven and earth to restore justice when the system had failed him completely. Judge Whitmore stood behind his bench for several long moments, testing his newly restored legs and marveling at the miracle he was experiencing. The sensation of standing under his own power was overwhelming after 3 years of confinement to a wheelchair. He looked down at Leah Robinson with an expression of profound gratitude and wonder, understanding that this child had given him back something he had thought was lost forever. The cynicism and weariness that had accumulated over 3 decades on the bench melted away, replaced by a renewed faith in the possibility of true justice. The courtroom remained frozen in absolute silence as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. Reporters who had covered thousands of stories found themselves speechless in the face of something that defied every rule of journalism they had ever learned. The jury members sat transfixed, knowing that they had just experienced something that would change their understanding of reality forever. Even the bailiffs, trained to maintain order in any situation, could only stand and stare at the miracle unfolding before their eyes. Leah Robinson looked up at the standing judge with a smile of pure satisfaction, her 8-year-old face radiating the joy of someone who had never doubted that this moment would come. Her blue dress seemed to shimmer in the afternoon sunlight as she stood before the bench, no longer just a child but a living testament to the power of faith and love. Her grandmother collapsed back in her seat, overwhelmed by gratitude and amazement at what her precious granddaughter had just accomplished through sheer determination and unwavering belief. When Judge Whitmore finally found his voice, it carried a strength and clarity that seemed to fill every corner of the courtroom. "In 30 years on this bench," he began, his words measured and deliberate, "I have presided over thousands of cases, but I have never witnessed anything that has touched my heart and opened my eyes like what has happened here today." His gaze moved from Leah to her father, and then swept across the entire courtroom as he prepared to deliver a verdict that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. The evidence that had seemed so damning just moments before now appeared in an entirely different light. Judge Whitmore's restored ability to walk had somehow restored his ability to see through the deception and manipulation that had characterized this case from the beginning. The financial documents, the witness testimonies, the elaborate web of lies constructed by Marcus Blackstone, all of it crumbled under the weight of a truth that had been revealed through the faith of an innocent child who refused to accept that her father could be guilty. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, Judge Whitmore continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "And in light of what I have witnessed here today, I find that the case against Daniel Robinson has been built on fabricated evidence and false testimony." The words hit the courtroom like lightning, causing gasps and whispers to ripple through the gallery as people realized that justice was finally about to be served. Marcus Blackstone's carefully orchestrated frame-up was being exposed for what it truly was. But the judge wasn't finished yet, and what he said next would ensure that Daniel Robinson wasn't just freed, but vindicated in a way that would restore his reputation and give him the fresh start he and his daughter deserved. The miracle in the courtroom was about to become complete, proving that sometimes faith and love are more powerful than all the money and influence in the world. Judge Whitmore's voice rang out across the silent courtroom with an authority that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. "I hereby declare Daniel Robinson not guilty of all charges and order his immediate release from custody." The words seemed to hang in the air like golden threads, weaving themselves into the hearts of everyone present and transforming despair into hope, and justice into vindication. The gavel that came down to seal this declaration sounded like thunder, its echo reverberating through the courtroom and into the souls of all who witnessed this extraordinary moment of truth triumphant. The bailiff moved quickly to remove Daniel's handcuffs, his usual efficiency now tempered with genuine respect for a man who had been wrongfully accused and miraculously vindicated. The metallic clicking of the restraints being unlocked seemed to symbolize the breaking of chains that had bound not just Daniel's body, but his spirit and his future. As the orange prison uniform was replaced with his own clothes, Daniel Robinson transformed before their eyes from a defeated defendant into a free man whose innocence had been proven in the most extraordinary way imaginable. Leah ran toward her father with arms outstretched, her patent leather shoes clicking rapidly against the marble floor as she covered the distance between them in what felt like both an eternity and an instant. When she launched herself into his embrace, the impact nearly knocked the breath from his lungs, but he held her tight against his chest as if she were the most precious treasure in the entire world. Her small arms wrapped around his neck as tears of joy streamed down both their faces, creating a moment of pure love that seemed to illuminate the entire courtroom with its radiance. The reunion between father and daughter was so emotionally powerful that there wasn't a dry eye in the entire courtroom. Hardened reporters found themselves wiping away tears as they watched this display of unconditional love and faith rewarded in the most miraculous way possible. The jury members, who had been prepared to deliver a guilty verdict just minutes earlier, now sat in stunned amazement at how completely wrong their initial assessment had been. Even the court stenographer had stopped typing, too moved by the scene before her to continue her professional duties. Judge Whitmore stood watching the embrace between Daniel and Leah with a smile that seemed to erase 20 years from his withered face. The miracle of his restored mobility paled in comparison to the joy of witnessing a family reunited and an innocent man vindicated. His legs felt strong and steady beneath him as he realized that he had been given the opportunity to correct a grave injustice while experiencing his own personal miracle. The cynicism that had accumulated over 3 decades of legal proceedings had been washed away by the pure faith of an 8-year-old child. Marcus Blackstone sat frozen in his seat, his face ashen with the realization that his elaborate scheme had not only failed but had been exposed in the most public and humiliating way possible. The billionaire developer's carefully constructed empire of lies was crumbling around him, and he knew that his own legal troubles were just beginning. The FBI agents who had been investigating the construction company's finances would soon have all the evidence they needed to build a case against the real criminal in this affair. His vast fortune would now be spent on defending himself rather than destroying innocent people. Daniel's grandmother made her way slowly down the aisle, her elderly frame shaking with emotion as she approached her son-in-law and granddaughter. The 3 generations embraced together, creating a circle of love that seemed to radiate warmth throughout the entire courtroom. The elderly woman whispered prayers of thanksgiving as she held them both, marveling at how her granddaughter's faith had accomplished what seemed impossible just moments earlier. The family that had been torn apart by false accusations was now whole again, stronger than ever before. The prosecutor sat at his table in stunned silence, knowing that his career would never recover from this unprecedented turn of events. His reputation for winning cases through any means necessary had been shattered by the pure faith of a child who refused to accept that her father could be guilty of any crime. The fabricated evidence that had seemed so convincing earlier now appeared obviously false in hindsight, and he realized that he had been manipulated by forces far more powerful and corrupt than he had ever imagined. Judge Whitmore raised his hand to address the courtroom one final time, his voice carrying the weight of newfound wisdom and humility. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have witnessed here today reminds us that justice is not merely about laws and procedures, but about truth, faith, and the courage to stand up for what is right. His words seemed to resonate through every heart in the room, inspiring everyone present to examine their own lives and beliefs. The miracle they had witnessed would change them all in ways they were only beginning to understand. The courtroom began to empty slowly, with people reluctant to leave the scene of such an extraordinary event. Reporters rushed to file stories that would challenge readers' understanding of what was possible in a world that often seemed dominated by cynicism and corruption. The jury members departed knowing that they would never forget this day for as long as they lived, and that their faith in the possibility of true justice had been restored in ways they never could have imagined. As Daniel Robinson walked out of that courtroom a free man, carrying his daughter in his arms, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows seemed brighter and more beautiful than it had in years. The nightmare that had threatened to destroy their lives was over, replaced by a future filled with hope and possibility. Leah looked up at her father with eyes that sparkled with joy and satisfaction, knowing that her faith had moved mountains and proven that love truly could conquer all. If this story has touched your heart and reminded you of the power of faith and love, make sure to subscribe to our channel and share it with everyone you know. Stories like this need to be told because they remind us that miracles still happen, justice still exists, and the faith of a child can change the world. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest truth, and today we witnessed proof that love really can move mountains and restore hope when all seems lost.